can go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. I'm Leah Thill. I'm the environmental planner with MACOG, and we're the Michiana Area Council of Governments. And this is our second meeting today. We wanted to host an evening meeting so that those who couldn't join during the day would be able to participate. Our goal is to introduce a grant that we got that can be used for brownfields to assess them, share with you what our priority focus areas are, and how you can submit new sites if that's why you're here, and then get involved in upcoming site meetings. This is more of a general introduction for the whole region. We're going to introduce our team that's helping us implement the grant, explain some of the concepts about brownfields so that we're all on the same page, and then we'll introduce the specific sites that we're working on towards the end, and we'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. We also have interactive Zoom polls built in, so you can participate in those as we go, and feel free at any time to chat. If you have other comments you want us to take note of, we'll be looking at that after the meeting, even if we don't address it during. There we go. So our Brownfields team for this project is made up of MACOG, and I'm going to let Vince, the lead here for Metric Environmental, introduce the rest of our team. Vince, you are muted. I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. All right. As you can see, so we are the grant consulting team that MACOG has hired to help to not only administer the grant, but do all of the work, all of the fine work that the grant allows us to do in terms of assessing sites and planning and doing some cleanup planning as well. So our team is made up of Metric Environmental and Roberts Environmental Services, Revitalize Communities, Recite, and Wolpert. So again, my name is Vince Epson. I'm the Vice President of Metric Environmental, and I'm assisted by one of our senior managers, Pat Likens. We are working together to be the lead of the team to make sure that the work with the grant, that we do the work with the grant, that we do the work well, and that we are advancing the opportunities that the grant will allow in terms of future redevelopment of brownfield sites. We also have Roberts Environmental working with us, and I'll let Jeff and Dave introduce themselves. So Jeff.
Thanks, Vince. I hope everybody can hear me. My name is Jeff Roberts. I'm the president of Roberts Environmental Services. We're based in Goshen, and so we're near the heart of the MACOG area, the 4 counties, and we've been tasked under this grant with conducting a lot of the phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, and also eventually helping out with some remediation planning. That's our primary role. As far as with Roberts Environmental, I have Dave Jeffers, who is really our lead person on making sure that these assessments and investigations get on the schedule and get completed. Dave, I'll let you introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yep. Hey, I'm Dave Jeffers, hydrogeologist with Roberts Environmental. And like Jeff said, we help out with the phase 1, the initial assessments of the properties, and then we also help out with a lot of the phase 2 work where we go in and actually collect the soil and groundwater samples. So Vince, back to you.
Okay, and then we also have Recite Development with us, and so we'll let Keith Veal introduce himself as well. Keith.
Hit that mute button. Good evening, all. Thank you all for attending this evening in this virtual format. My name is Keith Veal. I am the founder and president of Recite Development. Recite is essentially a brownfields redevelopment company, and my role on the project is to really help support the planning effort, help engage all the members of the team with all of the stakeholders, and navigating the road to brownfields redevelopment. and all that it entails. So it's a pleasure to be on the team and a part of this forum, albeit virtually. And I look forward to great things. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Keith. And we also have Yolanda Boucher with us from Revitalized Communities. That's also helping us with planning and community outreach as well. So Yolanda, if you'd introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you, Vince. I'm Yolanda Boucher. As he mentioned, I'm the principal and owner of Revitalized Communities. It's a community and economic development consulting company. And as Vince says, I'm helping with community involvement and helping to guide reuse options. I also recently retired from the EPA and was the Brownfields chief for Region 5, also served as the regional chief for community involvement.
All right. Thank you, Yolanda. And one that I did forget to introduce herself. Pat, if you would introduce yourself. I think I talked past you introducing yourself. Pat's a critical part of our team, making sure that the wheels turn and that all the pieces are together so that we do the job that we're hired to do. So Pat, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Pat Likens. Vince just described to you what my role in the project is. I just try to kind of keep things moving, keep things organized, make sure we're getting the project done. I'm formerly the chief of the Superfund program in the state of Indiana. Worked many years in environmental investigations, such as we're going through with these sites, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
All right. Thank you, Pat. And again, we are all happy as a team to be able to work with MACOG and working with and through this grant. And we'll go ahead now and turn over to Leah, and she'll talk about the coalition members.
So one other person to introduce you to, we've got someone from the MACOG leadership team on the call as well. Zach, if you just want to say hello.
Hi, yeah, this is Zak Dripps. I'm the Deputy Director with MACOG, and I just want to also say thank you for everyone who joined us today to learn about our Brownfields Coalition and the work that we're doing, and I hope that we're able to answer your questions, and again, I think Leah and the rest of the team here and all the work they put into this. So,
all right, so a little background on our coalition. We have 4 member counties, and I already saw a few of you from Kosciusko County joined. MACOG also has 3 other counties that are members: Elkhart, Marshall, and St. Joseph. We want to get to know a little bit about where you all are from, so I'm going to start a Zoom poll that you can go ahead and take. Let's see. There we go. So the first one that we would like to know is what category we can best understand your participation as representing either a resident or maybe you represent a local government, Chamber of Commerce. We had a lot of local government people and businesses this morning. I imagine a lot of you are joining in your spare time, so you might mostly be residents. Yep, looks like. All right, looks like 88% of you are residents, which is really great that you are all able to participate today. The second poll is the area that you represent, and if you work in one county and live in another, maybe you select more than one county. If you have a business where you work across the whole region, maybe it's all of these. Great. So I'm going to share the results. You can see we have some really good representation from Kosciusko County, which we didn't have as much earlier this morning, so that's great. All right, so moving on with our introduction to the grant, MACOG received $600,000 from the EPA last fall, and we got off to a bit of a slow start due to COVID-19. We delayed our initial in-person meeting from the spring, and so we've now gone virtual with that. So we hope to introduce you to that grant and what the possibilities are for what that can do in your community. There are other grants that can conduct cleanup from the EPA, but that is not something that our grant can do. We'll talk more about what our grant does do. But I first want to introduce the concept of a brownfield because that might be unfamiliar, or perhaps you're only familiar with Superfunds. But really, a brownfield is a site where there's a stigma or perception that there's some risk related to environmental contamination on the property, whether or not it is actually contaminated. And our assessment grant can do inventorying, planning work, phase 1, phase 2 reports and sampling, community outreach. But again, unfortunately, this grant does not come with cleanup dollars. Here's some examples of typical brownfields. Usually they're fairly easy to spot. And again, that's because there is no formal list that the state maintains of, these are the only brownfields. Really, it's any site where there's that stigma, that perception. Often industrial areas, which used to be located in places where now they're mostly residential. So there's that conflict there with those old properties. And gas stations are also really common. We'll be going through this a little bit in detail later on, but we have an inventory that we've put together. So I'm just going to keep moving for the sake of having more time for questions. Our targeted focus areas are the Warsaw and Winona Lake gateway, where Argonne Corridor is. We have some scattered sites in downtown Elkhart. We're focusing on an area west of downtown Plymouth, where we're working with Habitat on single-family home redevelopment there. And then our final focus area is any small town. So we're working with several, and we encourage sites in other small towns to be submitted to be considered for our grant funding. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Yolanda, who's going to talk more about brownfields.
Thanks, Leah. As you heard earlier from Leah, brownfields are either known to be contaminated or suspected of being contaminated because of their prior use. This can be a pretty scary proposition for most people. Residents near the site don't like the blight and they fear being exposed to contaminants. And it's also really scary for possible investors. Many don't want to pay for land and then have the responsibility to gamble on what's in the ground. They have to find out what's there, determine how they wanted to redevelop it, and then they have to clean it up. All of that before they can break ground on the new reuse plan. And that all costs a ton of money, so often they end up walking away. Next. So why would we redevelop brownfields with all that risk? We go through so much effort, and the reason for that is all the reasons here. It increases the quality of life, and it allows communities to have more resources and more opportunities for growth. Most importantly, it makes communities healthier and safer. The picture here is in Mishawaka. It's a very large blighted industrial site that was redeveloped to a beautiful mixed-use riverfront property with a park, luxury apartments, a beer garden, and several other uses. This provides more options for the enjoyment of community members, and it invites visitors to come and enjoy an exciting, vibrant area that increases revenue and attracts businesses and jobs. Next slide, Leah. Other reasons to develop brownfields, well, it just makes sense. The EPA and other organizations recognize the importance of this, and they give local governments free money to find out what the contaminants are in the ground, clean them up, and sometimes plan for the reuse. When they do this, developers and other purchasers feel better about buying the property and making it useful again. It also means they are responsible to the community members. Most of this money comes with the requirement that the community is informed and involved in all of the process. The grantee and the government work hand in hand to make sure the process goes through all the phases it's supposed to, and the funding is also used properly. Next. So once the property is cleaned up, it can be redeveloped. It can be redeveloped and put into proper reuse. This is not just for huge industrial sites like we saw a couple of slides back. It can also go towards small lots in residential as well as commercial areas. Here's some examples of some smaller sites. An abandoned gas station is now a small pocket park. An old bakery is now a Subway sandwich shop. An old NIPSCO site is a new microbrewery. These old blighted areas are now productive areas residents can be proud to use. So This is just a visual of the EPA's process for utilizations of grantee funds. Here's how it's laid out. Grantees such as MACOG identify sites with reuse potential. Some local governments have already nominated the sites, and now we're asking you to also give us your thoughts on sites that you think might be brownfields. They will research the chosen sites to find out prior use and possible contaminants. That is done in phase 1. Then they will work with the state to inventory it in their voluntary cleanup program. That way it's sure to be cleaned up to the state standards. In the phase 2 assessment, actual samples are taken at various depths to analyze and determine the type and level of contamination. That's when we look at all the possible reuse options to determine which would be the best and safest for the amount of cleanup we need to do. We'll share these ideas with you and we'll get your thoughts on the best reuse. Then the cleanup plan is done and submitted to the state and to EPA. This plan is also called an APCA, which stands for Analysis of Brownfields Cleanup Alternatives. Once it is known that money has been provided to get the property to this point, it's much easier to get funding from other sources to achieve the final goal, and that often attracts developers to invest. Then the cleanup is done and redevelopment can happen. So, and as you can see on the side of this slide, community involvement is required every step of the way of this process. Next slide. So as you see, the process is continual to get properties and communities redeveloped. It also starts with planning. The work is done to get to the property ready for reuse, and then it goes into redevelopment, and we start all over again with the next property. As you can see, redevelopment is kept in mind during the upfront planning, and it is also part of the end product. The environmental work is the means to get to that reality. Thank you, and I'll give it back to Leah.
Leah, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. So I'm launching a Zoom poll. Yep, there you go. A couple people got it. To gauge what you think about brownfields in your community, if there are a few, too many to count, or if you know, you need more information to understand what this question is asking. Excellent. All right, so by and large, you all feel like there are a few sites that come to mind that need to be addressed. And we have a second question here. What are the most important reasons to you to redevelop brownfields? And try to pick your top 3. And if there's something that we didn't cover that's also important to you, feel free to type that in the chat. All right, I'll share the results here. Just the aesthetic improvement and reducing the blight, those came up as the strong favorites, improving the community property values, and some strong support for protecting public health and the environment, and also opportunities to create jobs as well. All right. So moving on to talk a little bit more about the grant activities itself and the grant process. So as Yolanda mentioned, we've been accepting sites from a lot of different stakeholders over the last year, and we accept sites from any of you if we're not addressing them already, to please nominate those. You can type that in the chat, or there's a nomination form on our website, and the link will be sent out to you after this meeting, probably early next week. We have a coalition of working group members that's made up of local government staff that evaluate those sites and score them, and we approve funding for sites based on that. We also have to determine that they're eligible, and that means the EPA or the state has to approve them. So it differs based on whether they're petroleum sites or might have hazardous contamination. But probably one of the biggest barriers we run into for an eligibility issue is an old gas station. If it's still owned by Shell or the one immediate past owner dispensed petroleum or something like that, that will trigger it being ineligible. So that's one of the first things that we would look at if there was an old gas station that any of you were interested in. So I want to hear from you on the call. If you are prioritizing brownfields, because there in some communities there are a lot, and there certainly are more than we can support throughout the region. What would the most important factors be for you when you're trying to decide how you're going to prioritize those sites? All right, just waiting on one more. There we go. All right, so just like this morning, the potential for reuse and redevelopment is by far the highest, followed by whether it's in a disinvested area. And this morning, being near downtown or at a community gateway was also very important. All right, I want to share with you all the scoring matrix that we've been using over the first part of our grant. One of the first things we look at, it's really a threshold criteria, is if the owner's willing to participate, we have to have site access, and they have to be cooperating and willing to try to redevelop it. Then the other two things we look at are the economic impact potential and sustainability in the environment. So there are more categories under economic impact, and you can look at this in more detail when we send out the slides. But this is how we've been kind of scoring all these many different sites that are being submitted to us. And you know, this is something that it's an iterative process. So if we, you know, the input that we get on what's important might inform how we assess sites or what we prioritize going forward. We also have a regional data portal that we've adapted from what the city of South Bend had, and we've made it go region-wide. Plymouth and the city of South Bend had their own grants for assessment in the number of past years. So that's why they have all these dots for their inventory. Just because there aren't a lot of dots in Warsaw or Elkhart, that doesn't mean there aren't sites. It's just there hasn't been an extensive effort so far to catalog them. But one of my goals also is to look at the sites we've already assessed over the last decade or so through various grants, and kind of keep track of those, which have been redeveloped, which ones never did and kind of fell off the wagon, and keep better track of this for our communities. Another thing to know is that you can find all the reports that we're working on in this data portal. You can click on a specific site, click on the link, and it'll take you to an open access Dropbox folder. We also have this really cool feature if you're into history or you're just interested, not even for brownfields reasons, but there's this little slider bar, and you can hover over areas where there are fire insurance maps and look at what used to be there throughout, you know, 1800s to the middle 1900s. So that's a pretty cool feature, but it helps to identify potential environmental risks from past operations that we may have kind of forgotten that were there. And the city directory in South Bend does that really well as well. This is only limited to that area because they spent a lot of resources in their first grant period going through actual paper city directories and cataloging them. But if you're interested in South Bend for any reason, you're purchasing property, this would be a good place to start looking at what used to be around or on the area that you're interested in. All right, so a little bit more now on the actual assessment work that our grant is funding so that you understand it a little better. I'm going to turn it over to believe it's Vince, yes. And he's going to talk more about that and about the cleanup process as well.
Very good. Thank you, Leah. So we've talked about some aspects of this throughout the presentation, but we'll get a little bit more specific about them. And as you can see from the slide, there's some processes that we go through, or phases of the environmental investigation that we go through. The first one being the phase 1 environmental site assessment. Basically what that is that we go out, and if there's a site that is eligible, and a site that we're interested in, obviously, we're going to go out and we're going to take a historic look at that site. And that means looking at things such as the Sanborn maps that Leah showed you a few slides back. We're going to look at government records. We're going to do interviews, get any type of information that we can, even anecdotal information, any type of information that we can get to assess the site in terms of, are there recognized environmental conditions, or in other words, is there a potential for that site to be contaminated? And so we follow a process that is called all appropriate inquiry, so that the site is assessed with a methodology that's acceptable to EPA, and so that a future purchaser can also be declared as a bona fide prospective purchaser, and be able to be shielded from liability from that site. So if they want to go assess it, if they want to go develop it, then they don't have that liability. Now, after we do the phase 1 environmental site assessment, if there is reason to suspect that there's contamination there, and that's not always the case, because remember, sometimes it's perceived and not real. But if there's a potential for it to be real, then we do a phase 2 environmental site assessment. And that's the intrusive assessment, where we go out and we collect soil and groundwater samples, and we analyze those samples to see if there are contaminant constituents involved with that environmental media. Sometimes properties that we're looking at assessing may have actual structures on them, so we can also go in and assess for asbestos and lead. Many times these sites can be older, and the older a building is, the higher the potential it's going to have asbestos-containing materials in it and lead-based paint. So we'll go in, we'll collect samples of it, and we will quantify how much material is there, because at some point throughout the process of redevelopment, those materials might have to be removed. That building might have to be demolished, and so those materials have to be handled appropriately. So that's why we do that. So after all the phase 1 and the phase 2 is done, there's any asbestos or lead that needs to be assessed, we can go into remediation planning. All the other work that we have done, the phase 1, the phase 2, asbestos and lead, will help us determine what type of actions need to be done to clean up the site. And we use this information to help us, along with in this case, the state of Indiana's RCG guidance, but basically that is our risk-based guidance that tells us, if you're going to redevelop this and you're looking at a residential scenario, this is the degree to which the site has to be cleaned up. If it's going to be a commercial industrial, this is the degree to which it's going to have to be cleaned up. And it also can be mixed use as well, where we'll use those numbers that the Indiana Department of Management has in their RCG guidance to help guide us with remediation planning. Again, remediation planning is just how are we going to clean this site up? What's the methodologies that should be used, and to what degree to clean up the site? So you'll see there in the next slide that we are primarily concerned with our soil and groundwater in terms of brownfield sites. And this slide here just illustrates some of the locations of this environmental media and the pathways for which contaminants can be exposed to humans and the environment. And remediation planning is just, how are we going to make sure that we limit that exposure, or we get rid of that exposure? Go to the next slide. And so oftentimes there will be continuing obligations if we find contaminants at a site and we develop a remediation plan. So I've already talked about the bona fide prospective purchaser, and the bona fide prospective purchaser has to have gone through a process where they have an AI compliant phase 1. And what that does is, again, it restricts or mitigates the liability that they would have, saying that IDEM is not going to come after them for a response action if there is contamination at the site. So oftentimes with that comfort letter, oftentimes we'll get a comfort letter that will talk about institutional controls for a site. And institutional controls for a site is how we limit exposure to any contaminants that might be there. So that's to take reasonable steps that you see there on the slide. Obviously, we want to make sure that we have access to the site, so providing full cooperation and access to the site so that it can be assessed and cleaned up. And again, providing legally required notices for discovery of releases. So if we are doing a phase 2 on a site and we see that there actually is a release, we have to report that to the state as well. So those are the continuing obligations that we have. Next slide. Okay, so we've gone through the assessment phase and we have determined that, okay, we've got some contaminants and it needs to be cleaned up. So we'll talk about Brownfields Cleanup a little bit here. Basically, we want to, in this program, we want to look at low to moderate levels of contamination. We don't look at we oftentimes don't look at hugely contaminated sites because those generally are for other programs such as Superfund or state cleanup to tackle those because they can become so complicated and expensive that it could really exhaust your grant pretty quickly and then you don't get as many brownfields redeveloped. So we look for low to moderate levels of contamination on these sites. Again, I talked about risk-based cleanup standards for soil and groundwater and reuse scenarios such as industrial, commercial, and residential. And then what we're trying to do with a cleanup plan or remediation planning is to prevent exposure to contaminants. So are we going to treat it, remove it? Are we going to contain it? Are we going to cap it? There are certain methodologies that we develop based on the level of contamination and based on the reuse scenario that we will employ in terms of a remediation plan that can be implemented later on down in the brownfields process. Next slide. Okay, so cleanup. So what we don't have in the grant is the ability to use the funds for cleanup. So cleanup is not funded in this grant, but there are other avenues to get sites cleaned up. There are other grants that can be applied for. And the good thing is that when you're in a program, when you have a grant and you've expended funds to assess sites, EPA then has the motivation to continue to fund activities throughout cleanup. Now, EPA cleanup grants are competitive, but if you have done assessment work either within the bounds of a grant or there are other methods that assessment could have been done, you're going to be much more competitive to get a cleanup grant. IDEM also has financial assistance too. For petroleum sites, they have a Petroleum Orphan Site Initiative. Those generally are gas stations or former gas stations, low interest loans, revolving loans through the Indiana Finance Authority, and supplemental environmental projects. There's money in that program as well too. So those are some of the areas where we can leverage money for cleanup activities. Next slide. Okay, and so now we'll talk about brownfields planning, and we'll have Keith talk about the planning process. Keith.
Yes, good evening once again. So what I would like to do is shift gears a little bit and kind of synthesize the information that we've had so far and put it in a little bit different context. So the planning, let's start with philosophy first. So as a brownfields redevelopment practitioner, my approach begin with the end in mind. And part of the reason why I have that approach is primarily this. So the brownfields program, the brownfields philosophy, is actually it's a real estate program that has an environmental component. And so much of and it's not to understate the importance of the environmental component, but it is to always look at the environmental component in the context of what it is we're trying to achieve, the end goal, the reuse vision. And so all of that comes together first in the planning process. And so planning is it's a conscious effort where you look at you see the site not as what it is, but what you would like for it to be. So you create that vision. That vision for that site gets created, and it is a part of all of the inputs that go into the Brownfields redevelopment process. So your involvement in this process is as critical as any other component of the process. So what's happened now is the plans have been developed, and the plans are the roadmap. And I believe there are more than 20 plans that your communities have come together and created, and they are as broad as area plans or corridor plans, regional plans, and then they get as specific as actual site plans. But within each of those plans is the roadmap. It is the roadmap for how you all want to see your community revitalized. And our role in this as Brownfields redevelopment practitioners, from planning, development, environmental, is to work with you and guide you through a pretty complicated process. So if you believe that, or you think that the environmental component to this is complicated, well, the development component, the redevelopment component is equally as complicated. And again, the reason why we like to begin with the end in mind is so that as best as possible, we create an efficient process. And so again, you guys have already done much of the hard work of visioning and laying out through the various plans what you would like to see. If we do our jobs efficiently and effectively, what we end up with is a redeveloped site within a neighborhood, within an area that fits the vision that you guys laid out in your respective plans. And so again, one of the things that that we like as the team like to focus on is creating a seamless transition from one phase of the process to the next. So it's while these things may seem to be, we have to get one accomplished before we move on to the next phase. We are working in concert, sometimes out front, sometimes behind the scenes, but there is always activity that is moving this entire process forward. And just finally, what really helps the process is when stakeholders like those of you who have taken the time out to engage in this process, stay engaged in the process. As a developer, I can tell you that it makes my job a whole lot easier when I go into a community and I am assessing a piece of property that I believe has a high redevelopment potential. And I'm working alongside an active and engaged community in the process. It makes the process a whole lot easier to navigate. So hats off to you guys for being engaged, and I look forward to you staying engaged. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. All right, so going off of what Keith was talking about and the visions that you all might have, the next question here is, what would you want to see most in your community? What would you want to see more of? And we can't have it all, so do pick your top 3 choices of what you would like more of. All right, I'm going to share the results here. This is interesting to me that retail came out on top this morning as well. So almost 90% selected that. And then second was housing, and green space also rated highly this morning. And if we didn't quite cover it, feel free to expand on anything that you're thinking in the chat box. So a little grant progress update here. I'm going to turn it over to Pat Likens from Metric to just kind of summarize what we've been working on so far this year with our first set of sites.
Hi, good evening again, and thanks for sticking with us. This slide is pretty self-explanatory. You can see that we have a concentration of sites in Warsaw and Elkhart, and other sites scattered about the 4 counties. We're anxious to add more sites to that list of accomplishments. We do have 19 approved sites so far. As far as our things we've completed, we've got 6 phase 1 environmental site assessments done, 1 more going on. We've done 2 asbestos lead paint inspections, 5 phase 2 ESAs where we took samples on the ground, and we've got 3 more of those ongoing. 1 further site investigation, which goes more deeply into possible contamination on a site. We've got 1 of those planned at the Con site in Elkhart. 1 reuse plan was done. It was a stakeholder plan done in the Argonne area, and we do have 1 cleanup plan done.
Great. So now we're going to take just a really short tour of what some of these sites look like. You may recognize these if they're in your community, but the point of showing with the arrows different visions for the future is not because that's what the city has said they want to see or any community members have said they want to see, but just to get you thinking about the different possibilities. And you know, this is the Con site in Elkhart. You know, is residential possible? Does the community want to see more retail there? That's something that we'll be getting into more later with site-specific planning. Here's another site, 1701 Sterling site that we talked quite a bit about in detail at this morning's meeting, because that's of great concern to the neighborhood that lives nearby. Here's a couple more sites in Elkhart. We have 2 in South Bend. We are already working on with a developer on this site and this site as well in that community in Portage, Midtown, South Bend. And I'll leave these Warsaw slides up a little bit longer because I have a feeling that's where a lot of you, that's what a lot of you are interested in. And there's been a lot of effort done in planning over the years, but what you may not be aware of is that the Kosciusko County Economic Development Corporation has engaged a consultant to prepare a vision plan to promote that area for its redevelopment potential and re-envision what that could look like. So that plan will be available soon. It's preliminary at this point. That's for the Gatke site, and then this is that same Argonne vision plan shown for Arnold. There's also another developer that's interested in this property. So this just kind of shows what might be possible, either demolishing it or saving part of the building as shown in this diagram, or demolishing it and rebuilding new are all possibilities at this point. All right, so what's next? We invite those who are interested in the South Bend sites to attend an October 29th meeting about the Ward Bakery building. We're still working out a timeline for meetings for the Elkhart sites just because there are so many of them. And then the next steps in Warsaw is that the Kosciusko County Economic Development Corporation is going to hold a stakeholder event, and there may also be other public meetings with the city of Warsaw related to planning for those sites and engaging with developers. Another thing that you can do is nominate new sites. We mentioned that we have 19 approved, and we have an inventory of sites that we're always evaluating and scoring and looking for opportunities to bring those forward. So if you want to add a new site, our website is listed there on how to get to that page. And if you have any questions or the form looks confusing, I'm happy to fill it out for you or kind of explain what we're looking for. So don't let that be a barrier to you submitting something. There's MACOG's contact information. Also feel free to reach out to me directly to my email. So I'm going to put that in the chat box. Some of you were asking. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.